Good afternoon, my name is Michaela Zhang, and I'm a reporter for your BBN News at 5. This afternoon, we are going to take a look back at an event that could have changed the course of history, the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs. We'll be interviewing three historians that have been studying the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs. So how did the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs invention impact the relationship between US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and what lesson did both countries learn? We will figuring out that today on our BBN news station. Our first interviewer we will have today is Kayla White, one of the most well-known historians of our time. So Kayla, I know that you have been studying deeps about the Bay of Pigs invention. What exactly it is?
The Bay of Pigs invasion was Americans' failed attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro, who was a Cuban communist revolutionist. On January 1st, Castro drove his guerrilla army to Havana to overthrow General Fulgencio Batista, who was the elected president of Cuba at the time. Americans were worried about Castro's decision since he was a communist and was afraid that he would leave America in danger. For the next 2 years, officials at the U.S. State Department and the CIA attempted to push Castro from power. On April 1961, the CIA launched a full-scale invasion of Cuba by 1,400 American-trained Cubans who fled Cuba when Castro came to power. The invasion were badly outnumbered by Castro's troops and surrendered in less than 24 hours.
Oh, so why did the US care about Castro so much that they wanted to assassinate him?
Like I said earlier, is because of Castro's communist beliefs, the U.S. actually decided to support Batista, who was a brutal dictator to the Cubans. This made the people of Cuba furious that Americans would back such an awful dictator like Batista. While the Cubans welcomed Castro's 1959 overthrow of dictatorial President Fulgencio Batista, the new order on the island was about 100 miles from the United States, which made the American officials even more furious than they were.
Oh, okay, I see. So why is the Bay of Pigs considered such a big event?
I don't think a lot of people in the world today understand the importance of this invasion and how it led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. After the Bay of Pigs, the Soviet Union and Cuba formed a strong relationship. After the seizing power in the Caribbean island nation of Cuba in 1959, Fidel Castro aligned himself with the Soviet Union. Then Cuba grew independent on the Soviet Union from military and economic aid under Castro. American planes were flying over Cuba since the USSR and Cuba had a strong relationship, and they were concerned about communism rising. When the American pilot flew over the Cuba, he saw a big building that looked like a silo. However, they were really nuclear missiles. This caused the 13 days of crisis that is now called Cuban Missile Crisis.
Thank you so much, Kayla, for that explanation of what the Bay of Pigs are and how it led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is Emma Fox, another historian that has been researching the Cuban Missile Crisis for quite some time. Emma, thank you for joining us today. Could you give us an overview of what the Cuban Missile Crisis is?
Yeah, so the Cuban Missile Crisis was a direct and dangerous confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War. It was the moment when the two superpowers of the time came closest the world has ever come to nuclear conflict.
When did this occur?
It occurred in October of 1959, and it was a 13-day standoff.
How did the Cuban Missile Crisis happen?
When the Cubans sought out the Soviet Union for help, Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, was happy to help Cuba. He then secretly deployed nuclear missiles to Cuba to counteract the threat from the U.S. In Italy or Turkey, and also to protect the island. The U.S. then discovered his plan when the plane flew over Cuba and they saw the nuclear missiles. So when the U.S. discovered the plan, the materials for the missiles were already set in place, meaning that the Soviet Union would not disarm them. And on October 16, 1962, military advisors urged an airstrike on missile sites and an invasion on the island. However, on October 22nd, JFK announced that the U.S. Navy would intercept all shipments to Cuba. The problem was that a naval blockade was considered an act of war, which meant that he now had to call it a quarantine, and this made Khrushchev very, very mad. He was saying how it was pushing them closer to nuclear war, and this was considered a major threat for the U.S. And after that, it was the most intense 13 days.
Can you describe what happened during this 16 days?
Yeah, so President Kennedy called a group of advisors and officers on October 16th and talked about a diplomatic crisis about the Soviet Union for 2 weeks. They then determined the action of arming their own missiles as unacceptable. It was hard for them to come up with a solution, though, because they didn't want to have a nuclear war with them. So, over a television broadcast, President Kennedy told the people of the United States about a naval blockade around Cuba that was preventing the Soviets from sending more missiles and military equipment. He also said that America was prepared to use military force if necessary for national security. And because both the USSR and the US were afraid of nuclear war, the U.S. Made an agreement with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev and offered to remove Cuban missiles in exchange for the U.S. promising not to invade Cuba. Kennedy also secretly agreed to remove the U.S. missiles from Turkey.
Thank you so much, Emma, for joining us today. Now we are going to hear from Whitney, our final historian, about the impacts of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs. Now, Whitney, what types of impacts were there because of Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs?
Well, I think that there was a major impact on the relationship between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. I think that the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs invasion also taught a lot of lessons that can be learned from.
Can you go more deep about how these two events impact the relationship between the Soviet Union and America?
Yeah, so I think that after the Cuban Missile Crisis, both countries learned a lot of valuable lessons, and I think they both realized that they had to be careful with one another, and because they didn't want to get into a nuclear fight. And less than a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet Union and the U.S. agreed to stop above-ground testing for nuclear weapons, which was a really big deal. And this was made so that there would not be any more miscommunications between the Soviet Union and the U.S. But at first, I'd say that there was definitely tension between the two. But as the years passed, it definitely got a lot better, and they became more civil with each other. They both knew the dangers of going into nuclear war, which is why they took these precautions.
What were those precautions? I know that there were some treaties that were signed after Cuban Missile Crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Can you further explain this?
Yeah, so in 1968, the U.S. and the Soviet Union signed a non-proliferation treaty, which was an agreement that was signed by several of the nuclear and non-nuclear powers, and this pledged their cooperation in attempting to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and nuclear technology. This showed that the U.S. and the Soviet Union were willing to sign an agreement in order to try to secure more safety. And in 1963, the U.S. and the Soviet Union actually signed a limited test ban treaty, and 4 years after that, in 1967, they signed an outer space treaty, and this basically prevented the development of nuclear weapon systems as satellites in space. And although these treaties don't have really anything to do with the Cuban Missile Crisis, these things happened because of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The U.S. and the Soviet Union got to where they were because of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And both powers had an interest in negotiating agreements that would slow down the development of these weapons due to excessive costs involved as well. And these agreements showed the progress that the United States and the Soviet Union had made throughout the years. And so basically both sides were aware of each other's nuclear powers, and they knew that if they were to attack one another, that the world would end. So basically the treaties came into play because they wanted to avoid this conflict.
Let me ask you this question.
Mm-hmm.
What lessons do you think the U.S. and the Soviets learned from?
Yeah, I think both of the countries realized how easy it was for the world to almost come to an end over a single miscommunication. And I think that this also reveals how fragile human politics are, and that sometimes the fate of the world can really depend on a few key leaders or individuals.
I think you brought up some really good points about how Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs impact the relationship between these two countries. Thank you very much.
Thank
all
you.
three of these historians for taking the time today for educate us on the Bay of Pigs invention and the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's all we have for today. Thank you for tuning in and see you next time on BBN at 5.